All right, welcome. Thank you guys for coming. This is great. I didn't even say anything yet. You guys are already clapping. It's probably because of them, but thank you guys for coming. It is super awesome to be back here with you guys. It's been, what, 3 years? And so I am just super glad to be back here, and it's good to see so many faces. My name is Tim Lapetino. I am the co-author of Pac-Man, Birth of an Icon. And today, this is actually a super fun panel, not because of me, but because we got two awesome guests who are a pair of the creators of Miss Pac-Man, who through that game and a bunch of others made a significant impact on arcade and video game history in the 80s and really beyond. So as part of GCC, General Computer Corporation, they worked together with both Midway and Atari to release all sorts of games for arcade and console. But I'm going to let them introduce themselves first. So why don't you guys go ahead?
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Kevin Curran, and I was a founder and president of GCC Technologies. And to my right,
I'm Steve Golson. I was a very early employee of the various GCCs, of which there were many. So I remember all the dirt.
and I met Steve at MIT at age
we were
17.
students.
We were
Yes.
students in the same dorm suite. So we've known each other for 45 years.
Long time. Yeah,
Long
you were a
time.
year behind me.
That's correct.
Yes. We have a lot of good stories there too.
Well, you guys started with my first question. Is like I wanted to hear the story of you guys met at MIT. I'm dating you and all of us, I guess here, 1977.
Correct. I met Steve in September of 1977.
Awesome.
Right.
So there's a ton of stories. I just want to tell you guys up front that we could spend several panels just listening to these guys, and you wouldn't even have to hear from me, which would probably make the panel way better. But I want to focus today. We really want to talk about sort of the strange and unusual birth of Miss Pac-Man specifically. Miss Pac-Man has a very interesting role as sort of, some people have called her the first lady of video games, but also just how the game came to be. So I mentioned MIT and how you guys met, but there's a whole story about how you went from students to sort of coin operators to video game developers. And let's start there. Why don't you guys talk a little bit about that? How did that happen?
It was him. Him
And Doug McCrae.
Doug McCrae.
So you don't just wake up and say, "Hey, I want to modify a video game and write it." People in life they have antecedent steps. And when I was a student at MIT, I was invited to become partners in a pinball machine by Doug McCrae, and we split the cost of a pinball machine. It was $600, and I invested $300 in that pinball machine. And we started operating that pinball machine and making money in our dorm at MIT. And then with the earnings, we bought a second pinball machine, which one of them is out here today, Playboy from Bally Midway. And we ended up running...
Good for MIT students.
Yeah.
Good choice.
And we ended up having about 20 games in roughly 5 or 6 dormitories on campus. And I went from being on financial aid to having no financial problems because of the cash flow from the pinball machines and video games. So video games were the more interesting part of the coin-operated route we built on campus. And not surprised, so when you bought a video game like Missile Command, Atari Missile Command, and you put it out there, you have a good coin drop initially as people are attracted to the game, it's new and exciting. They maybe don't play it that well, so they try again and again. Then as you get familiar with the game and you get better, the coin drop goes down. So we, being students, and I was studying electrical engineering and computer science, I looked at a video game, coin-op video game, and said it's really a personal computer, basically, with one program that runs again and again and again, and we could rewrite that program. So I came up with the idea of what I called an enhancement kit. Should I keep going like this?
Yeah, no, you're great.
All right. So I came up with the idea of an enhancement kit. I mean, people were trying to make games more interesting by changing the clock and just have the thing go.
There were speed-up kits. There were these things were what they were called in the industry, and they literally electronically sped up the game. And so Kevin's like, no, we're going to enhance the game. It's not going to just speed it up. It's going to be better. So.
Yeah.
He's still a student, by the way. Okay, he's allegedly a student at one of the top engineering schools in the world, and you and Doug, and you're doing this on the side. So
Yes.
okay.
So you have a mental model that you have basically a personal computer running a program, and programs have subroutines and what have you, and we decided to enhance and improve Atari's missile command. And I called up Atari's general counsel office, and I said, hey, I'm thinking of doing...
Did you tell him you were like,
A student?
yeah, sophomore at MIT or junior or whatever you were? Oh, by the way, I've got
No, I didn't tell him that. I don't,
okay, all right. Just clarify that. All right.
And the person I got, Ken Nussbaum, the name just popped into my mind. Ken Nussbaum, I think, was assistant general counsel. I told him what we were going to do to Atari's missile command. He was like, hey, no problem. Okay, I didn't get it in writing, but he sure told me that. And so what we did, and Steve was involved in that, is instead of going to Florida our senior year for spring break, we broke those 9 days down into a crash program to rewrite Missile Command as Super Missile Attack. And we wrote a whole bunch of subroutines to improve the gameplay. And you go, okay, well that's interesting, but I didn't want to copy any Atari code. I sensed a legal problem. So the idea was we would have Atari code and then we'd have general computer code, and you'd have to jump between the two. I'm sure there's engineers in the audience that understand this idea. And we came up with a hardware solution where we would monitor the address bus. And we would on certain addresses, we would swap control from one ROM set to another ROM set and then go back. And that was the template for how we enhanced Atari's Missile Command. And Missile Command was, in some ways, structurally a precursor to what we did with Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man.
So let's, go ahead.
No, I just wanted it's really important to understand the distinction between the types of these speed up and modification kits that had been done before, where they would, whoever was developing it would wholesale sell you a new set of ROMs that you would plug into Galaxians or plug into whatever game. And yeah, they've changed some of the code, but the way they delivered it to you was by copying a whole bunch of the existing code. I mean, technically it works great, but legally it's not a good idea. And Kevin's idea was, okay, we're going to sell a little board, and it requires the existing Missile Command ROMs to be plugged into it for it to work. Oh, and there's a couple more ROMs, which is our stuff, and there's some magic circuitry to switch between the two. So there's no copying. We're not copying any it requires the Missile Command code in order to work. So you were interesting.
So you were very careful, like even back then, because you had taken I think you told me you'd taken an intellectual property class. Is that right? Is that
No.
It was just MIT knowing
smart.
that there were, there were consequences to legal actions, right?
Yeah.
You wanted to avoid it.
So even though you had done that, not long after you guys made a good amount of money selling these, right? You were selling them out of the ads and trade magazines and things like that. But then Atari came calling, and they tried to sue you for $15 million.
Correct.
Right.
So, although Ken Nussbaum told me verbally Atari had no problem with what we were doing, when the kits started to sell in volume, they were like, uh-oh, this is a problem. Because they were made, they had their hands full with several issues. One, they could see directionally if we keep reprogramming their cabinets, they're not going to make as much money. The other thing was that video game copyright law was very unsettled in the world back in 1981. I mean, it was unclear. The mafia was making outright copies of video games. I mean, identicals, that shamelessly doing that. And there was an assertion by attorneys for the people who all say were organized crime that, the copyright law of the United States applied to a fixed expression in a media. Like when you watch a movie, it plays the same every time. You listen to Hey Jude, it's the same song. Whereas they said, no, with a video game, when you play the game, you're a co-author. And as a co-author, copyright law doesn't apply because your gameplay might be different than your gameplay.
And that's what the mafia lawyer said.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And
It's my guys.
It was very unclear. It's true. It was interesting legal times. Yes.
It was, you know, you don't get this experience much in life, but I was at, what was I, 20 years old. I remember sitting 20 in federal district court being interrogated by a federal district court judge who wanted to understand how video games work. I mean, I was in the witness box because of what was going on with Atari and what have you. And Atari, we teamed up with a very sharp lawyer. Some of you might be aware of Jerry Hosier. Have you ever heard of Jerry? He's somewhat notorious in some spaces, but he's a great patent attorney, and he's a very bright man. And at the end of the day, Atari had people making illegitimate copies at one end of the spectrum, and they had this handful of students from MIT who were asserting, you can overlay subroutines on the Atari code and reprogram the game that you legally purchased. And that was terrain Atari didn't want to be on. They were trying to stop the people making illegal copies. That was a big, big problem. And we started doing well legally with the enhancement kits. And, you know, the judge was like, well, you know, this person bought that game, paid for it, that license is not revocable, and you're selling some software and you didn't copy their code.
Yeah, why can't you modify this object that you bought? Sure, I mean, you can do it with cars, right? Modify things. And so it sounds reasonable.
Right.
Sounds reasonable. Yeah.
So after a particularly rough string of legal issues where Atari wasn't doing too well, Skip Hall, I was at Cooley Goddard in Palo Alto. And Skip Hall took me into a conference room and basically said, and this is in your book, what do you guys want? I mean, they didn't want to have a loss. So with Atari video game and copyright and a headline in the Wall Street Journal, that was a no. So they're like, why are you guys doing this? What do you want? And I said, well, we want to develop original video games. We want to work with you. And they're like, fine. And they gave us a $250,000 downstroke, $50,000 for 4 years per month, $50,000 a month for 4 years, and we went off to, and you could do what you want with it. And we went off
You were no longer a student at this point, correct?
No, I was on a leave of absence.
There you go. You're still on leave of absence, I believe.
I am
Is that
still,
correct? Okay.
I'm still, I will go back. I hope this isn't too technical, but I mean, so they gave us this money, and they really expected us to go out and party and disappear. We built a company with that. I mean, I remember calculating, that's a lot of money. And you gotta multiply these numbers by 10 for inflation right now and purchasing power. I mean, that was 2.65 million roughly, and that's 26.5 million. And we started doing work for them, and they were very, very happy with the work we did. But there was one and Skip Paul said, no more doing enhancement kits, guys. This is a problem. We sell the coin-op games. You don't do enhancement kits. That's done. And I said, well, Skip, there's one more product we've developed, Crazy Auto. And it was basically an enhancement kit for Pac-Man.
So you have this Crazy Auto that you guys have been working on.
During the lawsuit.
Yes.
While the lawsuit's happening.
Because you weren't busy with anything, right? You know, you had lots of time.
Right.
I mean, you're not going to class.
Well, we're answering the phone. No, we're answering the phone when people call and want to buy super missile attack kits. And we have to say we're not allowed to sell them to you because we're under temporary restraining order. And, you know, Atari sued us. And the arcade people would just go livid. We'd say, you know, call Vice President so-and-so at Atari. Tell them how upset you are. So
here's his number.
We're busy doing that, yes. But we're working on this kit because we think we're gonna defeat Atari in court, no question. We know we're doing the right thing, and then we're gonna have another kit ready to go.
Right, so now you have this development deal with Atari. You could have just said, okay, we're going to focus on that, but you have Crazy Auto that you've worked on. We can talk about that in a minute. But the thing that just always blows my mind, I mean, I guess at this point this is not a surprise, that you said, okay, well, let's talk to Midway, who had the license from Namco in Japan, in Chicago, Midway, to put Pac-Man out. So you reached out to Dave Moravsky at Midway with this kit, knowing full well the only way that you could make this is if they agreed to it, because that's what you had sort of put into your, the legal agreement with Atari, we would only make enhancement kits if the company said it was okay.
Absolutely true.
So we could argue this was maybe one of the biggest phone calls that you ever make. Walk me through, first of all, this is not a question, it's really just a comment. There's a bit of, what's the word, the chutzpah? To call up Dave Morosky, Vice President of Midway, arguably one of the hottest video game companies of that moment. They've just come off of manufacturing Pac-Man, which is the best-selling arcade game in the United States at that time, selling almost 100,000 cabinets, and you're like, Dave, you don't know me, but we need to talk. That's sort of what you did.
That's true, and it sticks very much in my mind. And I'll pause for one moment. I'm going to answer that question. I'm going to add one thing in that's really important. Because we were operators of video games, and we tracked the cash flow weekly and daily, we knew what people liked and didn't like. Now, I didn't realize, doing it, you're like, well, that's obvious. You don't understand what you're doing to track the data. But a lot of people aren't that disciplined. And we had Crazy Otto on test in the field. We knew we had a winner. We knew we had a valid sequel or a second version of Pac-Man. And we knew that customers would enjoy playing it and it would be successful. So, with the lawsuit settled, I called up Dave Morosky.
And that was not public knowledge, though, right?
No, well, this is pre-internet. I mean,
right.
Technically, it was probably recorded in a court somewhere, but it takes a while for that information to disseminate. But I was on the phone in the next day or two. I didn't want to waste any time, and I called up Dave Morosky, and I told the white lie. I said, "Hi, Dave. I'm going to be in Chicago in the next few days." That was the white lie. I was trying to tee up the meeting, and I said, I identified who I was, Kevin Curran with General Computer, and we had this enhancement kit for Pac-Man. And he said to me, well, you guys are in legal trouble with Atari. And he referenced the case in a general sense, and I said, and yes, we settled the case, and we have a development agreement with Atari, and we're allowed to go forth and bring this product to you. I mean, I didn't say you had to approve the product, but I said we're allowed to bring it to you, because Skip Paul said if they do a deal with you, more power to them. So we decided to bring the product to Midway and work cooperatively with them.
So you guys took the prototype and you had it already out on test. You felt like you had some data and you knew that it would sell well. So you guys traveled to Chicago, to Midway. Steve, this is where I want to ask you about this. So you guys are meeting in the room. You've got Dave Morosky, you've got Stan Jarocki, who's also an important part of the story in terms of, he was part of the marketing team, but he was much more of a creator than just a marketer. We'll get to that in a minute. But you guys have brought these boards now, these prototypes, right? These are hand prototypes.
Yeah.
And you're setting them up for these guys to show them. Can you talk through that?
So a couple of things. I don't know if we met Morosky at that meeting. I remember being in Stan Jarocki's office with the big tiger on the back of the wall. It's a big painting with a tiger. I don't think we met Morosky, did we?
I think Morosky was there because I set up the meeting with Morosky.
Yeah, okay. So I'm the engineer along, right? Because Kevin and Doug are the partners. They're doing all the negotiations, but I'm the hardware guy, and so I've got my briefcase and I've got my little kit in there. And one other, I'm not sure if we ever actually had it out on test at that point.
Okay.
I don't know if we had.
I think we did, but don't.
Maybe, anyway, in any case. And so I've got this handcrafted little circuit board that I've made, wire-wrapped board, and that I had plugged in on our Pac-Man at home and got it to work. But, I mean, this is early days. This is just barely functioning, right? And so they're like, well, we're going to show this off. Okay, they go onto the production line and they pull a Pac-Man game and put it into a conference room with me, with my briefcase, and then you and Doug are like sitting with Stan.
And we're talking and buying time while he's trying to bring up the prototype.
So I've learned since then not to trust anything coming off a production line. But this game comes in and I'm like, it's fresh off the production line. I do not need to test it. It must be working. And so I immediately rip it apart and plug our little board in and turn it on and do nothing. And I'm like, oh my God, is my board not working? What is going on? And so I unplug everything. I disassemble all the stuff I've just done, put it back together so it's just Pac-Man, turn it on, nothing. It's dead. What is going on? And so I'm futzing with this back and forth, and
we're dancing, shooting the breeze.
With Stan. And I finally have to go in and say, there's a problem with this machine, bring me another one. And, so talk about panic. And just, they did, they wheeled in another machine, and we tested this one first. It's like, yep, it powered up. And I plugged in my board, bam, no problem. It ran Crazy Otto. So that was a little tense moment there, but we got it working. And they brought in one of their people off the production line who was a very good Pac-Man player. And he fired it up and he played Crazy Otto for a little bit. And he's like, oh, yeah, okay, this is fun.
And so they liked it, right? And so
They liked it. Oh, they showed off their new game that they were very proud of as well. Do you remember?
Yeah, it was not so good.
Bostonians. Yeah, they were like, yeah, we're real proud of this new game too. So anyway, so we traded games.
Right. So they really liked it, and they appreciated it, and they thought it was good. And so now you have the framework for making a deal. So there's a whole story here, you guys, buy the book.
Yeah.
It is a very good book, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So the follow-on to that was they said, well, we want to put them out on test. And so then I made 3 more robust prototypes. They shipped me Pac-Man boards, and I worked them out, shipped 2 of them back to Chicago, and then we put one out on test. And so there were 3 out on test.
Right, and so they saw it, and they impressed. But my question is, now you've got this game that you've made. You've got a different character. You've got Otto in there. You've got these storylines about Otto meets a female Otto, which is kind of a red-looking, named Anna, right? You guys named.
Well, yeah, buried away in the code. It turns out that that character had a name, and I think Otto, Anna, right? 2 letters repeated, kind of thing. So I think that was a Mike Horowitz. Away.
Right.
None of us remembered that until 40 years later. I went back and looked at them. Oh, look.
Right, when we were talking about
She had a
this.
name.
So Otto and Anna are the characters in this game. But how did you get from there to Miss Pac-Man? Like, I think that's the big part of this, because this is now a collaborative effort. Now you're working with Midway.
Yeah.
They're communicating with Namco.
Yeah.
Tell them.
So I'll tell you a little bit, because aside from the negotiations, so this is in October. This is like in the span of 3 weeks, okay? And the business side of it is getting negotiated. But also on the technical side, it's, well, okay, we very carefully came up with this character, Crazy Otto, because we did not want to use Pac-Man, because that's a trademarked character. So if we are going to be completely independent in selling it, it has to be different characters. Well, now, if we're working with Midway, we can use Pac-Man. And so initially the game was going to be called Super Pac-Man. And it was going to be just the Pac-Man character. So it was kind of unclear during that whole negotiation there, is it going to be Super Pac-Man? Is it going to be Crazy Otto? What's it going to be?
Right. I mean,
the idea of the character changing was already on the table.
When we signed the license agreement with Midway, it was actually for Crazy Otto.
Yes, that's what it says.
In October of 1981. It was not labeled Pac-Man or Ms. Pac-Man. It was labeled a Crazy Otto license.
Yes.
But we, early on, and I think the Japanese wanted it to still be Pac-Man. And I think Stan Jarocki wanted a female character.
Yep.
Did that come from Stan?
Well, the female was in Crazy Otto, because it was in the cutscenes.
Right.
They meet,
That was
they fall
Anna.
in love, they have a baby. All of that was already there, thanks to Mike Horowitz, who came up with that story.
Right.
So the idea of the female character was there in Crazy Otto, but the idea of let's make the female character the main one, that came from Stan, and who knows? Because I took this phone. I remember you talk about phone calls. You remember?
Yeah.
I remember I took this phone call from Stan Jarocki, and he says, "Steve, we want to make the female character the main character in the game." I'm like, Stan, what are you thinking? All those young teenage boys in the arcade. Oh no, it's going to be great. Well, his marketing skills were way better than mine, clearly, because he was right. And so that was we want to make it female, and we want to give it lipstick and a bow, and all. They had all these ideas for what the character would look like. And so we started, okay, 14 by 14 pixels, sure, we'll see what we can do. And off we went.
That's a lot. Come on, how many
Well,
pixels?
they didn't realize it. See, they didn't have, their own people tried to prototype up what the character would look like.
Oh.
And they thought it was 32 by 32. Because they didn't develop any of the hardware, it all came from Namco in Japan. So they were like, well, we prototyped it up, and they like mailed it to us or faxed it or something. And I'm looking at it, dude, no, that's 4 times as many pixels as we actually have. It looks great in Chicago. It's like, well, a quarter of the pixels disappeared on the way to Cambridge. So,
and it's a fax too, right? So it was very clear.
yeah, I was like, oh, what color is that? I don't know. So yeah, so we went back and forth a bit about what's the character going to look like, okay, it's the female character, and then what's the name going to be? And that was the other.
Yeah, the name was a very big issue.
Yes.
Right,
And this, again, this is like in the span of 2 weeks. Okay, now we're into November, and we're just back and forth with them about what should it look like and what's it going to be named and all this. And so.
Right, and so some of the big issue was, okay, the storyline is, you know, this character and Pac-Man meet, fall in love, have a baby. In 1981, if you have a baby with the guy, Midway's feeling about it was they should be married, right? They should, you know, because we don't want to promote any sort of unsavory, you know,
Yes.
shenanigans, let's say.
Well, it was for a while. Initially, it was Miss Pac-Man.
MISS.
MISS, Miss Pac-Man. And I actually have the very first prototype board, and that's what it says at the bottom of the board, Miss Pac-Man. And then it was like, again, in the span of a few days, oh my God,
I think
no.
it was Stan Jarocki who wanted to go with Ms. Pac-Man, MS. It did not come from me. I remember being a little nervous about Miss having a child potentially out of
Yes.
wedlock.
Yes.
And then there was also this issue that
Dirty.
Oh,
yeah,
terrible.
but look, Marshfield, Massachusetts banned video games as being evil. So we were trying to just make sure we didn't end up in a big controversy.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Oh, can you imagine? You know, think about today. What starts a controversy, and that would have been, you know, illicit electronic baby back then.
Yes. So where did now Mike Horowitz
Yes.
says his wife Eileen was a big promoter of, well, it should be MS, right?
Yeah.
It should be Ms. Pac-Man. And so, but who suggested what? Because it was Miss MISS and it was Pac-Woman.
Mrs.
It was Mrs. I think that was part of
came
it
from
for a while.
Midway.
Mrs.
Yeah.
Pac-Man for a bit, but then it was like, no, Ms. Pac-Man. Okay.
But Mike's wife was also a Ms. herself.
Correct.
She had her
Yeah.
own last name.
Yes.
From what I understand is that came from her. And
Yes.
she suggested, no, this should be a Ms. Pac-Man because she's a 20th century woman. She is
Yes.
independent. She is a feminist. You know, like she can hang, right?
Yeah.
The kids say today, right? She can hang. So that was the idea, right? And the idea, and this is a cultural moment where that was more in the air. Like, you know,
Yeah.
we don't really say that a lot now, but
Right.
that was very much of that cultural moment.
Yeah, the other thing you need to understand is that for us, at that moment, working at GCC, the important thing to us was our Atari deal, okay? We had this deal with Atari, and we were getting paid so much a month, and we were blasting ahead doing arcade game designs for them and working on this, and we've got this little thing we're gonna do for Midway too. We've got to finish that up. And they keep calling us up and make a change this name, change this, change the, whatever. So we're just trying to get it done, get it out the door. And we're so done with that crazy auto thing. Right. We want to go work for Atari. So that was another part of it, was like, don't spend a lot of time on this. Just get the damn thing done and out the door. What do you
Right.
want us to call it? MS? Fine, whatever. Okay.
Right, but
So-
but the idea that now, in looking back on it, I think
Looking back on it,
right,
yes.
it's huge, it's significant.
It was huge.
So
Yes.
Ms. Pac-Man, you know, and a big part of this, and you didn't say this, and I don't even know that you knew this when you were talking with like Dave Morofsky, is that they had wrapped up the biggest game they had ever made. Their production line, which grew immensely during this time was about to shrink really quickly. You know, they're going to have to start laying off people because, I mean, that's what happens when you know, do you expect to have another bestseller where you're cranking out this many cabinets every month? Probably not. And so, what were your, Steve, we talked about this at one point, what were your expectations for Ms. Pac-Man? Like, if you guys thought if you sold, what, 10,000, 20,000 cabinets?
Yeah, I remember having this conversation with Kevin McDonald, who was a representative for MMI, which made these PAL chips, which were integral to the hardware design. And why did this matter? Because he needs to know how many PAL chips might get sold. It's like, Steve, how many of these cabinets are going to get made? And just as an aside, so we had designed it as a kit that was going to go exclusively into existing Pac-Man cabinets. But now we're in Midway, and Midway, it says, we're just going to make them as new games. Sure, okay. So they can keep their production line going. Almost identical, because it's Pac-Man with this little board plugged into it, right? So, I'm talking, Kevin McDonald's like, how many are they going to make? And I was like, well, 10,000 would be a really good build. You know, if they sold 10,000 of these games, that's okay. That's a pretty good build for arcade game. 20,000, wow. You know, that would be awesome. And you get beyond that, you know, 70,000 was Asteroids.
We never considered.
Phenomenal. So I was like, you know, 10,000, 20,000 maybe. That's the sort of numbers that we're imagining it might be.
Right, and the final number ends up being somewhere between 116,000, and we talked maybe as many as 130,000.
Yeah, I'm, you know, Tim, I read that in your book, and I will tell you, we were paid royalties on over 130,000 cabinets.
Wow.
So I derived my number from the royalty statements and the checks that came in.
They cleared too. Right. Although some of that...
And they're not going to aim higher on that one.
No.
It may be that some of those were not United States.
That was what.
So that might be, if you're saying how many were sold in the United States, okay, maybe that's 114 or 116 or something. I don't know. But hey, it was a lot. It was a lot.
Yeah.
It was a ton.
It was a ton.
So now, so we got about 3 minutes, and then I want to open it up for questions. But one of the things I just want to look back on here, so you think about, you guys had made this game, you know, you were really focusing on, okay, what are the things that expert Pac-Man players can do, and how can we sort of subvert that? How can we make an interesting game that is still Pac-Man?
Pattern play. Pattern play had to
Kill
be
the
defeated.
patterns.
Yeah.
Yes.
We were talking about that this morning. I had experience and exposure as in high school to writing pseudo-random number generators. And that was the seed of what we put into Ms. Pac-Man, which defeated pattern play. Now I'll pass it to Steve.
Yeah, so, I mean, it was obvious that was one of the big things to change in the game, is stop the predictable behavior of the monsters, of the ghosts, and to kill the pattern play. And the players would enjoy that. So how we actually ended up implementing it was using in the Z80 processor, there's this little free running counter for DRAM refresh. Hardware people, remember DRAM refresh? Yes. So yeah, that's gray hairs, the gray hairs remember this. And so there was this little running 7-bit counter, and it was almost truly random. And so that's what we ended up using. So you could just read this value and say, oh, I need 3 bits of randomness. And it wasn't a lot of randomness, because it was basically at a certain point in the algorithm, the monster decides to go back to its home corner, and it randomly says, oh no, I'm going to pick a random corner. And that was just enough. It was just enough to screw up the predictability of the algorithm.
Yeah.
So
you created a fun game. Like, you know, we're not having this conversation 40 years later if that game is not
People are playing it out there.
fun and challenging, right?
Yeah.
But the other part that I would put out there is that the storytelling that happens in this game started out with Otto and Anna. The idea of like meeting, falling in love, and having a baby became Miss Pac-Man. Miss Pac-Man became this storytelling, you know, not a lot of storytelling, right? We're not talking cutscenes, we're not talking, you know, in-game, you know, world decisions. We're talking about these little bitty animated things that grew into a storyline of Pac-Man has a wife, they have children, they have all this stuff, and that led to so many other things. It led to storylines in the cartoons, it led to sequels, it led to merchandising and all
Junior
these...
Pac-Man.
Right, yeah.
Yes.
You guys know how little baby Pac-Mans are made, right? you do now. But ask your mom and dad, they'll tell you. But you have all of these things that really put Pac-Man front and center in the culture and keep putting the character in the culture, which I think is some of why we're talking about it today. And for me, it's like, the programming, the business acumen, the savvy that you guys demonstrated by making these games and also getting a good deal to make it happen. But also, this storytelling bit is a huge part of why, an influence of Pac-Man in the culture.
Yeah. A credit, there were these little intermission cartoons in original Pac-Man.
Right.
It did not tell as much of there wasn't as much of a storyline as there was in Ms. Pac-Man. Right. So that was our inspiration. It's like, to put these little things into a game, because it was a lot of work to put those animations in there to make that happen. But it was, what can we do? And I think a lot of that credit goes to Mike. I think it was Mike Horowitz who came up with he says it came to him, I think he was driving or something. He's like, we'll have the two characters, and they meet, they chase, they have a baby. Okay. Or the baby arrives, let's put it that way.
Same old story.
Yeah, exactly.
Boy meets girl.
As one does.
As one does. All right, well, why don't we open it up for questions? If you guys want to line up, there's a mic here, so you just want to come on forward and keep it short, keep it clean. Let's do it.
Or not.
Lots of great stories, I really appreciate it. One thing that really stood out for me was, I think Kevin said there's a royalty deal on this Pac-Man. That couldn't have been common back then for developers, was it? And if so, how was that pulled off? Did you get pushback against the royalties?
Royalty deals actually were very common back then, to tell you the truth. Namco was getting paid on every cabinet of Pac-Man. Namco moved their IP portfolio to the United States because the United States had intellectual property rights. Japan was the Wild West. And the deal they had with Midway was they got paid on every cabinet that was sold. So paying us a royalty was expected and accepted.
And that royalty stream stayed to Namco for all of Ms. Pac-Man.
Wow.
Okay, because it's a Pac-Man cabinet. All the Pac-Man ROMs are in there. So, in effect, Midway was paying double royalties because they kept paying Namco, and they were paying us, and they still made a boatload of money. So
They made enough money to build the casino, the Valley Casino in Las Vegas.
there you go. Hadn't thought about that. Let's go. Okay.
Yeah, you mentioned randomization. What other gameplay considerations did you have?
So having more than one maze. So again, because we were willing to add extra ROM to have more than one maze, and the thought being that the player gets here's a new maze game. They would play it, they get through the first rack, the second rack, and okay, I understand how this works, and then bam, there's a new maze. And they get that for a couple of racks, and then bam, there's another new maze. It's like, how many are there? And then they finally. So that was another big change. And then the last really big change was making the bonus character move around the maze. All right, Pac-Man, it just sits there. The bonus shows up, and you have to go in a certain amount of time, you have to go and get it and come back. It's like, and I think this was Phil Carrot. I think it was, he certainly animated it. I don't remember if it was his idea to make it move around. But, so the bonus character comes in, and it randomly picks a path. So that's another piece of randomization. When the bonus comes in, how does it come in and how does it bounce around the maze? There's like 16 different paths it can pick, and it picks one. So that randomization adds to it. And then later in the game, which bonus you get, it doesn't just max out and give you the maximum bonus forever. It starts cycling through and randomly picking. So this randomization shows up in many places in the gameplay. But I'd say that's the biggest one, more mazes. Okay. Because that added much more complexity to the game of trying to understand the dynamics of the character motion given the constraints of the maze. And so you get 4 mazes. There you go.
Good question.
Yeah. And all sorts, new colors and sounds and music and all that sort of stuff too, but that might attract you to the game but doesn't affect the gameplay.
So presumably at least one of those Crazy Auto boards still exists. Can we ever play it?
Come and see me afterwards. You can play it because I have it on my laptop. or you can come to my house and you can play it. The intellectual property is an interesting question because it doesn't really belong to us. Okay, we sold it. And my story is always when Namco releases the ROMs free and clear for Pac-Man, then I can do it for Crazy Otto. But until then, no, I can't. Now, it's safely put away. Don't worry. You know, from a historical standpoint, it is. But you can come and see it, and I can show it to you how it plays and what's different about it. And I have some of the other versions as well, the Pac-Woman and the different characters and things, so you can come and see it if you want.
California Extreme in Silicon Valley has it sometimes.
Yes, because I brought it. Correct. Yes, I brought it to California Extreme. So get them to invite me again, and I can bring it. You can put it out, I'll play. So I bring my board and we can put it in and you can actually play it. And it's kind of fun. It's fun watching the really good Ms. Pac-Man players play because it's got some very subtle differences between the final code and they pick it out. This is different. I'm like, yes.
Actually, I have a twofold question. One, do you still own the rights? Do you still generate revenue? And two, who is responsible for actually disassembling the code and documenting it so you guys could write?
All right, we'll do it in reverse order. With Super Missile Attack, we acquired in-circuit emulators. We basically dumped the code. We annotated it, went through it by hand ourselves, and figured out what the code functioned as, you know, how it functioned.
Yes.
So that's the answer to that question.
Yeah.
Use
It was the same thing for Pac-Man.
Same thing for
We
symmetrical.
could disassemble the code and then by hand, laboriously figured out how different parts of the code work. Reversing engineering it.
So as to ownership of rights, basically in the 80s, we sold our interest in the intellectual property to Bally, Midway, and Namco. Namco put their intellectual property rights in their video games in the United States, then they brought them all back. So effectively, we transferred our rights to Namco. It is a short answer to a long story.
With a royalty stream.
Coming back to us
Yes.
in perpetuity. Recently, we were contacted by a Taiwanese businessman, Taiwanese, yes, PK.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
he wanted to buy our future royalty stream, so we entered into a transfer agreement with him.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. So the long answer is no. Short answer, yeah.
So that actually covers part of what I wanted to ask, but I also wanted to ask, just to like kind of visualize it, what kind of tools did you have back then? Like what were you programming on, and like how does it get out of whatever computer onto an actual physical board?
Tools. We had this very high-tech device called a pencil. It was we can have a long discussion about exactly how this happened, but really it was, we could disassemble the code for Pac-Man. It was slightly different for the missile command, but we could disassemble the entire code image for Pac-Man and then print it out on a line printer on 132 column fanfold paper and print it out, and then start laboriously annotating it by hand in, well, what did this do and what did this do? And you had some very specific questions like, oh, what could, what does this location in memory get used for? Now, we had an in-circuit emulator, so we had this fancy big computer that basically gives you direct control over the microprocessor, and you can do things like, oh, when you get to this address, stop. Okay, so you could set breakpoints. When you access this memory location, stop. And so you could say, what's this memory location used for? And so you could set a trap, and it would run the game, and it would stop. And you go, what value are you putting in there? And what's it? Oh, hey, I just put a coin in. And you could start understanding, oh, that piece of memory must be used for keeping track of the coins. And that's the sort of, you're trying to disassemble and understand this 16K bytes of code. You know, it's hundreds of pages of Z80 assembler code that you're trying to understand. Now, a lot of it we did not need to understand. We just needed to know enough to modify what we wanted to change. So, but that gives you a little hint of it.
Yeah.
There's an enormous
There's
amount of work.
hundreds of pages that you printed out.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We-
I can bring it with me.
You know, I remember at Missile Command, Super Missile Attack, we had Missile Command's code on the dining room wall taped up. And we would just literally write on it. And it's like, you know, that's what this address does, that's what this subroutine does. It was just brute force looking at it.
Yeah. You could do things like, oh, here's this subroutine. I wonder what it does. Well, I can just take it out of the game, right? Take it out of the memory image and see what's different about the game. Oh, there's no missiles. Oh, I guess that's the routine that draws the missiles, right? I mean, you could do really stupid brute force things like that to try and understand what's getting used. Yeah, we did. Yeah. You know, lots of Coca-Cola and late nights and not graduating. It's sort of,
Okay, so you guys, I know there's a bunch more people with questions. We are out of time, so I want to do 3 things. But one, first of all, if you do want to continue the conversation with us, you're going to all head over to the ground control booth where I would be signing books, and get these guys to sign them too if you want. You can also buy a book, Pac-Man Birth of Icon. I'm not selling them, ground control's selling them. So support them, and it's great. I'm happy to write whatever you want in the book, nothing dirty. Also, and then 2, thank you guys. Thank you guys for coming, but also let's give a huge thank you to Steve.